The laughter cut across the chlorine like a slap, and three young men in board shorts were pointing at a leathery shoulder near the deep end. The shoulder belonged to a quiet swimmer who had folded his towel into a perfect square on the lounger before stepping in. On that shoulder, faded to the color of weak tea, sat the silhouette of an eagle clutching a trident and a flintlock pistol. The boys whooped and slapped each other and asked, loud enough for the entire pool to hear, where Grandpa had bought his temporary tattoo. The swimmer did not flinch. He did not look up. He adjusted his goggles, took a slow breath, and lowered himself another inch into the water as though the noise above him were just weather. Behind the snack bar, an off-duty lifeguard stopped wiping down the counter and went very still, because he had seen tattoos like that before, and he knew what came next. Stay with me on this one. The community pool sat at the edge of a small Florida town named Mariners Cove, tucked between a strip mall and a stand of slash pines that cracked and whispered whenever the Gulf wind came in off the water. It was the kind of pool where retirees did slow laps in the morning and children took over by noon. There was a cracked concrete deck and a fence wrapped in green plastic mesh that the wind had peeled loose at one corner. The man with the faded tattoo had been swimming there every weekday morning for almost 11 years, arriving at 6:50, leaving at 8:10, never a minute different. He paid his annual membership in cash. He brought his own towel. He nodded at the desk attendant, signed the laminated sheet with a careful left-handed signature, and walked to the same lounger near the shallow end as if it were assigned to him. Most of the regulars knew his face, but not his story. He was just the old man who swam. He lived alone in a single-story bungalow 3 blocks from the pool. His house was painted the color of butter, with hurricane shutters bolted neatly to the wall and a small garden of pepper plants beside the porch. Inside, the rooms were almost empty. There was a recliner, a small television, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf lined with paperback histories. On the wall above the recliner hung a framed photograph of a young woman in a sundress. Her name had been Alina. She had died of a stroke 9 years earlier, on a Sunday afternoon, while he was at the hardware store. He had come home to find her on the kitchen floor. He had not cried at the funeral. He had cried in the garage 3 weeks later, alone. His morning routine was simple and unvaried. He woke at 5:30 without an alarm. He drank 1 cup of black coffee and ate 1 piece of toast with butter. He read the local paper from the back to the front. At 6:30 he laced his old running shoes, slung a faded canvas bag over his shoulder, and walked the 3 blocks to the pool, taking the same route every day, past the same houses, nodding to the same paper boy. He had once been a runner, but his knees had given out years ago, and now swimming was the only sport that did not punish him. In the water he could still feel the shape of the man he had been at 20, lean and strong, cutting through the surface without resistance. He swam 30 laps. Always 30. Never 29, never 31. After the last lap he climbed out, dried himself with the same blue towel, dressed slowly behind the changing room curtain, and walked home. The other regulars at the pool had a quiet affection for him. There was Margaret, a retired schoolteacher with a paddleboard. There was Hector, a former mechanic who did water aerobics with his wife. There was Sue, who ran the front desk and kept a tin of butterscotch candies under the counter for the children. None of them knew the swimmer's last name. They called him Frank because that was what he had told them, and they did not press for more. They knew he was a widower. They knew he had served because there was the tattoo, and because he held himself with a particular stillness that civilian men rarely had. They did not know which branch. They did not know which years. They had never asked, and he had never offered. He had not always been quiet. There were photographs, locked in a small fireproof box in his bedroom closet, of a younger man with a wide, easy grin, his arms slung around the shoulders of other young men in green and tan and gray, in places with names most Americans could not pronounce. There were medals in that box, too, wrapped in soft cloth, with ribbons faded by time and salt. There were patches and pins, and a folded letter from a president whose signature had bled slightly across the years. He had not opened the box in a long time. He had told Eleanor once that he was finished with all of that. She had kissed his temple and said she understood. She had been the only person on earth who truly did. Now he was 71. His hair was white and clipped short. His face was the color of a worn saddle. His eyes were a pale, patient blue, the kind of blue that always seemed to be looking at something just over the horizon. There were scars on his back, on his thigh, on the back of his left hand, but the years and the sun had blended them into the rest of him, and most people no longer noticed. The trident on his shoulder was the only mark anyone ever asked about, and even then, only rarely. It had been inked there in 1976, in a cramped studio in Virginia Beach, by a man with shaking hands and excellent eyes. It had cost him $40 and a six-pack of beer. He had been 21 years old. He had not yet earned what the symbol truly meant. That spring, the pool had grown busier than usual. A new apartment complex had opened nearby, and with it came a flood of younger residents, students at the local college, fresh transplants from up north, weekenders who came to drink wine on the deck and post pictures of the sunset. Most of them were polite. A few were not. Among the new arrivals were three young men, juniors at the state university, who had rented a unit together for the semester and treated the pool like their personal lounge. Their names were Tyler, Brendan, and Ashton. They were tall and tanned and loud. They wore matching sunglasses that cost more than the swimmer's monthly grocery bill. They had no idea who he was, and they had no interest in finding out. It began on a Thursday morning in late April, the kind of morning when the air was already heavy by 7, and the pool's surface lay flat as glass. The swimmer arrived at 6:50, as always. He nodded to Sue at the front desk. He took his place on the lounger near the shallow end. He folded his towel into a perfect square. He stepped to the edge of the pool, adjusted his goggles, and lowered himself into the water without a splash. He pushed off the wall and began his first lap, his stroke steady and economical, his breathing slow. Tyler, Brendan, and Ashton arrived at 7:15, carrying a small cooler and a portable speaker. They had clearly not slept. Their eyes were red, their voices were too loud, and their laughter had the brittle edge of people who were not as funny as they believed themselves to be. They set up at a cluster of loungers near the deep end and turned on their speaker. Bass thumped across the deck. Margaret, doing slow circles on her paddleboard, sighed audibly and paddled toward the steps. Hector, in the shallow end with his wife, shook his head and muttered something in Spanish. The swimmer, in the middle of his 8th lap, did not appear to hear the music at all. He turned at the wall, kicked off, and continued. The boys cracked open cans of seltzer that almost certainly were not seltzer. They lounged. They scrolled their phones. After a while, Tyler stood up, stretched, and wandered toward the edge of the pool. He looked down at the swimmer cutting smoothly through the water, and then, for no particular reason, he looked at the swimmer's shoulder as it broke the surface on each stroke. Something on it caught his eye. He squinted. He bent down. He laughed. He turned back to his friends and called out, loud enough that even the lifeguard in the high chair turned his head. He pointed at the swimmer. He said something about a tattoo. He said something about Grandpa playing dress-up. Brendan and Ashton got up to look. The three of them stood at the edge of the deep end, sunglasses pushed up on their foreheads, and laughed as the old man completed another lap. They asked, between giggles, whether the tattoo had come from a cereal box. They asked whether Grandpa had bought it at a Halloween store. They asked whether his grandkids had drawn it on with marker. Their voices carried across the water, across the deck, across the snack bar, and into the small office where Sue was filling out the morning sign-in sheet. Sue stood up so fast her pen rolled off the desk. She walked to the door of the office and looked out. Her face went very still. Behind the snack bar, the young man wiping down the counter, an off-duty lifeguard named Marcus, also went very still. Marcus had served 4 years in the Navy. He had not been a SEAL, but he had spent enough time around them in San Diego to know exactly what the eagle, trident, and pistol meant. He had seen the tattoo on the old man's shoulder once, 3 months earlier, when the swimmer had reached up to adjust an umbrella. He had not said anything then. He had simply nodded and walked away, the way you nod at a saint passing through a parking lot. Now he watched the boys laugh. He watched the swimmer reach the wall, turn, and push off without breaking rhythm. The old man had heard every word. Of course he had heard. The pool was small, the morning was quiet, and his hearing, despite his age, was still excellent. But his face, when it broke the surface on each breath, showed nothing. No tightening of the jaw. No flicker of the eyes. He swam another lap. And another. And another. Margaret was now standing at the edge of the pool with her paddleboard tucked under one arm, glaring at the boys with the full force of 40 years in a third-grade classroom. Hector had stopped his exercises and was watching with his arms crossed. The boys did not notice. They were filming now. Brendan had his phone out, panning slowly across the swimmer as he stroked past. He narrated in a fake old man voice, asking the camera if the audience could see the brave warrior in his natural habitat. Tyler doubled over laughing. Ashton called out, asking the swimmer when he had stormed the beach at Normandy. The swimmer reached the wall at the shallow end. He stopped. He lifted his goggles and rested them on his forehead. He stood up in the chest-deep water and looked, for the first time, directly at the 3 boys. His expression did not change. It was not angry. It was not amused. It was the face of a man reading the bus schedule. He held the gaze for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he lowered his goggles, took a slow breath, and slid back into the water like a knife into a sheath. It was that movement, more than anything else, that made Marcus put down his rag and reach for his phone. Because Marcus had seen exactly that look once before, on a chief petty officer in Coronado who had been disrespected at a bar by a drunk Marine. The look had not preceded violence. It had preceded a quiet, surgical kind of consequence that had ended with the Marine waking up in his own bed the next morning with no memory of how he had gotten home, and a deep conviction that he should never set foot in that bar again. Marcus did not call the police. He called a number in his contacts that he had not used in 2 years. The number belonged to a man who had been his commanding officer's commanding officer, a man who lived now in a condo 2 miles up the coast, and who, Marcus was almost certain, had served alongside the swimmer a very long time ago. He stepped outside the snack bar to make the call, and as he did, the front gate of the pool swung open, and a man in his late 40s walked in. The man was about 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing khaki shorts and a navy blue polo. His head was shaved clean. He moved with a calm, balanced economy that civilian eyes could see but not name. He was carrying a small gym bag over one shoulder. He paused inside the gate, looked around, and his eyes settled immediately on the swimmer in the pool. His name was Commander David Reyes. He was 46 years old. He was an active-duty Navy SEAL on 2 weeks of leave to visit his mother in the apartment complex next door. He had not been to this pool before. He had heard about it from his mother, who had mentioned over breakfast that there was a quiet old man named Frank who swam there every morning, and who, she said, reminded her of David's late father. If you can listen to one more story today, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and let me tell you what happened next. Commander Reyes set his gym bag down on a lounger. He did not glance at Tyler or Brendan or Ashton, who were still filming and snickering near the deep end. He walked instead directly to the edge of the pool near the shallow end, and he stood there with his hands at his sides, and he waited. The swimmer reached the wall. He stopped. He looked up. For a long moment, neither man moved. The swimmer's pale blue eyes met the commander's dark brown ones, and something passed between them that no one else on the deck understood. The commander straightened. He brought his right hand up in a slow, perfect salute, the kind of salute that was not for show, the kind that was held a half-second longer than regulations required. He held it. He did not speak. The swimmer in the water lifted his goggles, set them on his forehead, and looked up at the younger man for what felt like a very long time. Then slowly he lifted his own right hand, water still running down his arm, and he returned the salute. The pool went silent. The music from the boy's speaker was still playing, but no one heard it. Margaret had a hand pressed to her mouth. Hector had taken a step forward without realizing it. Sue was standing in the doorway of her office with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, blinking hard. Tyler, Brendan, and Ashton stood frozen, their phones still raised, their grins beginning to falter, because even they, in their willful ignorance, could feel that something significant had just happened, even if they did not know what. Commander Reyes lowered his hand. He stepped to the edge of the pool, knelt down, and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the swimmer to hear. He said, "Sir, it is an honor." The swimmer in the water did not reply for a moment. Then he said in a voice rough from disuse, "The honor is mine, son." The commander stood. He glanced finally at the three young men with their phones. His face was perfectly calm. His jaw was tight. He turned and walked to a lounger several feet away from theirs, set down his gym bag, and began to stretch. Tyler lowered his phone. Brendan lowered his. Ashton, who had been the loudest, swallowed once and looked away. None of them spoke. The bass on their speaker thumped on, ridiculous now in the silence. The swimmer pushed off the wall and began another lap. He had 10 more to go. He swam them at his usual pace, his usual stroke, his usual breath. When he was finished, he climbed out of the pool, dried himself with his blue towel, and walked, as always, to the changing room. Commander Reyes watched him go. Then he turned slowly and walked over to the three young men. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He sat down on the empty lounger beside theirs and asked, conversationally, whether they had a few minutes. They nodded, mute. He asked whether they knew what the tattoo on the old man's shoulder meant. Tyler shook his head. The commander nodded as if this confirmed something. He asked them to put their phones down. They did. He asked them to turn off the music. Brendan reached over and silenced the speaker. Then Commander Reyes told them a story. He told it quietly, without flourish, the way a man tells a story he has carried inside him for a long time. He told them that the symbol on the old man's shoulder was called a trident. He told them that it was earned, not awarded, after one of the most brutal training pipelines in the United States military, and that fewer than 20% of those who began it ever finished. He told them that the man swimming laps in front of them was named Francis Walter Doran, that he had been born in 1955, that he had enlisted in the Navy at 17, and that he had completed Bud S training in the autumn of 1974 with the highest cumulative scores in his class. He told them that Frank Doran had served 26 years on active duty, and that during those years he had been deployed to places that did not appear on any map, and had taken part in operations that did not appear in any history book. Then he told them about the spring of 1987. He told them that in March of that year, intelligence had picked up a hostage situation in a remote mountain region of a small Central American country whose name the public had been told to forget. He told them that 26 American aid workers, including 8 nurses and 2 children, had been seized by an armed group operating from a fortified compound at the head of a high valley. He told them that the compound had been considered impregnable, that 2 prior attempts at negotiation had failed, that one of those attempts had ended with the execution of an aid worker on camera. He told them that on the 11th of April, a small SEAL team had been inserted by night into the mountains above the valley. He told them that the team had been 6 men. He told them that the assistant team leader, a 29-year-old chief petty officer, had been Frank Doran. The boys did not speak. The commander continued. He told them that the team had moved through the mountains for 2 nights, carrying their gear on their backs, sleeping in shallow scrapes during the day. He told them that, on the 3rd night, they had approached the compound from a ridge that the enemy had believed to be unscalable. He told them that the team had split into 2 elements at the last moment. He told them that Frank Doran's element, 3 men, had been responsible for clearing the western wing of the compound, where the hostages were believed to be held. He told them that as the assault began, the 2nd element had been pinned down by a heavy machine gun on the eastern wall, and that one of the men in that element, a corpsman named Reyes, had been hit in the leg. He paused there. He let the name settle. The boys looked at him. He nodded once. Yes. His father. He told them that Frank Doran, hearing the call over the radio, had broken from his element, crossed 40 meters of open courtyard alone, and silenced the machine gun. He told them that Doran had then continued through the eastern wing on his own while the 2nd element regrouped, that he had moved room to room in near total darkness, and that when the operation was finished, 6 hours later, all 26 hostages had been recovered alive, including the 2 children. He told them that the after-action report, which had remained classified for 17 years, had credited Frank Doran with neutralizing 47 enemy combatants over the course of the night, a number that had been verified by satellite imagery and by the testimony of the surviving hostages. He told them that Doran had been wounded twice during the operation, once in the thigh and once across the back, and that he had carried the corpsman, the commander's father, down the mountain on his own back when the extraction helicopter could not reach the ridge. He told them that Frank Doran had been awarded the Navy Cross for that night, in a private ceremony at a base in Virginia, 3 months after the operation, with no press present and no public record. He told them that the corpsman had survived, had returned home, had married a woman from Mariner's Cove, and had named his only son David, after the first name of the man who had carried him down the mountain. He told them that his father had died of a heart attack 6 years ago, and that one of the last things his father had said to him in the hospital had been that if he ever met a man named Frank Doran again, he should thank him. The boys sat very still. Tyler's eyes were wet. Brendan was looking at his hands. Ashton, who had been the loudest, was staring at the surface of the pool as if he had never seen water before. The commander did not raise his voice. He did not lecture. He simply told them, one more time, that the man whose tattoo they had laughed at had walked through a courtyard alone, in the dark, while men with rifles fired at him, to save the father he had never had the chance to meet. Then he stood, picked up his gym bag, and walked to the edge of the pool to begin his own swim. The boys did not move for a long time. Eventually, Brendan reached over and quietly turned the speaker all the way off, then unplugged it, then put it in his bag. Tyler, the one who had pointed first, stood up and walked slowly toward the changing room door. He stopped a few feet from it. He waited. The door opened. Frank Doran stepped out, dressed in his soft khaki pants and a faded button-down shirt, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder, his white hair combed neatly back. He did not look at Tyler. He looked past him, toward the front gate. "Tyler said, sir." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "He said, sir, I am sorry." He said it quickly, before he could lose the courage. He said, "I did not know. I am so sorry." He could not seem to find any other words. Frank Doran stopped. He turned his head and looked at the boy. For a moment his pale blue eyes moved over the young, frightened, apologetic face, and something in his expression softened, the way the sea softens at dusk. He did not smile. He did not frown. He nodded once slowly. He said in his rough, quiet voice, "No harm done, son." Then he added, "You have a good day." And he walked past Tyler and out through the front gate, into the white morning sun. Brendan and Ashton came up beside Tyler at the changing room door. The three of them stood there for a long while, watching the gate swing slowly shut on its hinge. None of them spoke. Behind them in the pool, Commander Reyes was pulling himself through his first lap, his stroke long and clean. Margaret was paddling slowly back to her usual spot. Hector and his wife had returned to their water aerobics. Sue had gone back into her office and was standing very still behind her desk, one hand pressed to her mouth. Frank Doran walked the 3 blocks home as he always did, past the same houses, nodded to the same paperboy. He let himself into his butter-colored bungalow. He set his canvas bag on the kitchen table. He poured himself a second cup of coffee. He sat down at the table across from the empty chair where Alina had once sat, and for a long time he simply held the warm cup in his hands and looked out the window at the pepper plants in the small garden. After a while he stood up, walked into the bedroom, opened the closet, and took down the small fireproof box from the top shelf. He carried it to the kitchen table and set it down. He did not open it. He just put his hand on the lid and held it there, the way you might rest your hand on the shoulder of an old friend. In the days that followed, things at the pool changed in small, quiet ways. Tyler, Brendan, and Ashton came back the next morning at 6:50, before any of them would normally have been awake. They were waiting on the deck when Frank arrived. They did not speak. They simply nodded to him as he passed. He nodded back. They began to swim, badly and with a great deal of splashing, in the lane farthest from his. They came back the morning after that, and the morning after that. By the end of 2 weeks, they could swim a passable lap. By the end of a month, Tyler had started a small fund among the new residents of the apartment complex to repair the loose section of mesh on the pool fence. He paid the contractor himself in cash. He never told Frank. Commander Reyes stayed in town for the full 2 weeks of his leave. He swam beside Frank every morning. They did not speak much. They did not need to. On his last morning, before he flew back to Virginia, he stopped Frank at the gate and asked if he could send him something. Frank shrugged and said he did not need anything. The commander said it was not a thing he needed, exactly. 2 weeks later, a small package arrived at the butter-colored bungalow. Inside was a framed photograph of a young Navy corpsman in the late 1980s, smiling at the camera, with a baby in his arms. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, "This is the man you carried down the mountain, and this is the boy he raised. Thank you from both of us." Frank set the photograph on the bookshelf, beside Alina's picture, where the morning light could reach it. He continued to swim every weekday morning at 6:50. He continued to fold his towel into a perfect square. He continued to nod at Sue and walk to his lounger and lower himself into the water without a splash. He did not speak much more than he ever had. But sometimes, on the way out, he would stop by the snack bar and exchange a few quiet words with Marcus, and Marcus would later say that those were the proudest conversations of his life. Frank Doran died 3 years later, on a Sunday afternoon in November, in his sleep, in the recliner in his small living room, with the framed photograph of Alina on the wall and the photograph of the corpsman and his son on the bookshelf, and a half-finished cup of coffee on the table beside him. He was 74 years old. The funeral was held at a small chapel near the beach. It was a closed casket, military honors by his own quiet request. The chapel had been expected to hold perhaps 30 mourners. 240 came. They came from across the country. They came in suits and in uniforms and in faded jeans. They came in wheelchairs and on canes. They came with their grown children and their grandchildren. Some of them had been hostages once, in a valley in a country whose name they had been told to forget. Some of them had been operators in places that still did not appear on any map. All of them had known Frank Doran in some way, and all of them had come to say goodbye to a man who had never asked to be thanked. Tyler, Brendan, and Ashton came too. They sat in the back. They wore borrowed suits. None of them cried during the service. All three of them cried in the parking lot afterward, leaning against Tyler's car in the white Florida sun. The trident tattoo, faded by sun and salt and the slow tide of years, went into the ground with him. But the boys he had taught, without ever meaning to, walked back out into the world and lived differently than they had before. And every weekday morning at 6:50, for years afterward, the lane nearest the shallow end of the Mariners Cove community pool was left empty by silent, common consent, in case the old man wanted to swim.